So, two questions today, both on China. One, what about China's debt? Steve had previously said it was something we should be worried about, but has he changed his mind on that? And secondly, China is becoming a lot more authoritarian, even more so than before, and focusing more on its domestic economy as well. What would the world be like if we traded less with China? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Now, a fine example of China doing what we in the West would never do is the requirement that for all computer games players, they have to register if they're under 18 years old and be monitored to ensure they only play 3 hours of computer games a week, 1 hour on a Friday night, 1 hour on Saturday, 1 hour on Sunday, nothing at all on school nights. Social control, you might think. I know a lot of parents secretly think, well, that's not a bad idea. I wish we could get our kids down to just 3 hours of computer games a week, but we can add it, of course, to the list of the ways that Chinese authorities monitor and control their population. So we'll look at how we continue to trade with a country like that and whether we'll reach a breaking point where we say enough is enough. We've got to look at human rights and all that stuff, and that's going to have an impact on who we trade with. But before that, Hilliard MacBeth, one of our listeners, Steve, says, I know you identified China as one of the countries likely to experience a crisis along with Canada, Australia, Hong Kong and so forth. Do you have an update on the private sector debt in China? And then on top of that, I'd like to add, whether a more authoritarian China will see less trade with the West and how that's going to change the global community. So how is China changing, in other words? That's basically what we're going to look at. How is our relationship and how is the country changing? But let's start with debt because they've got it all, haven't they? They've got government debt, they've got local authority debt, they've got private debt, and yet still, despite all this debt, their economy just seems to keep growing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to give the absolute statistics on it, the level of government debt in China, and of course, if anywhere is able to successfully carry out the basic ideas of MMT, it's China, in the sense that they're not worried about, they don't have any stupid politicians complaining about budget budget deficits in hindering future generations in China. That's 67% of GDP, and that's risen from back when the data began, which is 1996, from 22% of GDP. So it's basically tripled over the last, over the industrialization period of China, but it's still on a global sense quite relatively low. Private debt, and funnily enough, there's data on private debt going right back to 1986, which I find a bit remarkable because I think that's still during the days of the Gang of Four. But that was 64% of GDP. It's now 220%.
Wow.
So that puts China's private debt level of countries like France, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. The interesting thing is when you break the debt down, you might think, given all the stuff about housing bubbles in China, we know that house prices have been rising ridiculously over there. It's actually predominantly corporate debt. So again, the series that the Bank of International Settlements provides starts in 2006 for China in terms of breaking down private debt into household and corporate. So there's a collected series going back to 1985, and there's a separated series from 2006. And household debt was 10% of GDP back in 2006. It's now 60%, so that's quite a six-fold increase. But that puts the level of household debt in China at about half the level of household debt in Australia, for example, which is, I think, a legitimate world record holder. I think the Swiss are taking steroids, possibly. The Swiss, the only country to beat Australia in a household debt to GDP ratio is Switzerland. And from what I've heard from friends of mine in Switzerland and people working in the banking sector there, a lot of it's the old Swiss gnomes hiding the wealth and hiding the debt of the rich in Switzerland. So I don't take the Swiss numbers seriously, but the Australian ones, of course, different story. But the corporate debt is the interesting one. And corporate debt, even right back in 2006, was 100% of GDP. Now that exceeds America's level. It's currently 160%. And interestingly enough, and this is one reason I take the data. I mean, you've got to be question data coming out of China. A lot of people that I know who specialize in China use data on, for example, energy consumption rather than GDP to work out what the GDP actually is rather than what the Chinese claim it is.
Interesting.
Yeah, but the data shows a very similar phenomenon in China to what you find in the West as well, and that's a dramatic increase in corporate debt when COVID hit. So the level of corporate debt was peaked at 162% of, I think 162% of GDP back in 2016. It was trending down, and you get to 2020, which of course is the beginning of COVID, it's down to 150% of GDP. Now, to put that in context, that's corporate debt at the same level as private debt in the USA, so a higher level of debt. But then it rose rapidly, and if you go from 150% in at the end of 2019, then it's one quarter later, 153, 156, 160, 162. But then it tops that at 163%. Now it's heading down again. Now, of course, we know that China is one of the few countries, even again, being skeptical about the statistics, China's lockdown worked to keep COVID under control. I think what China's total number of cases has it cracked 100,000? It's
I don't know, but
low.
I mean, new cases, as they say, is down to zero, don't they? They're back to zero COVID. Whether they can maintain that or not, I don't know. But the reason why they're getting this big increase in corporate debt, obviously, is because they are making it easy for people. So whenever there's concerns about liquidity, for example, the People's Bank of China steps in with their, what they call their medium-term lending facility, which is basically a one-year loan to the commercial banks. They just, they've kept that low. It's at 2.95%. Obviously, it's not as low as it is elsewhere. But they've also sort of said to commercial banks, lower your reserve requirements. We're not too fussed about that.
That's a bit of a waste of time, but yeah.
So lend out more money, and if lending out more money means you've got cash problems, don't worry, borrow it from us for a year and at a low interest rate. So it doesn't sound enormously sustainable, but I mean that's the way they're managing to put out this money to companies so that they can increase their debt. But there's a danger in that, isn't there? Because aren't they going to hit a point at which this debt could all come crumbling down? So there's a company, Evergrande, for example. It's one of the biggest companies in the world. It's got 1.95 trillion yuan debt, which is over $300 billion US, more than the GDP of Finland. If a company like that fails, and it could, that's going to have a flow-on effect, isn't it, through a country like China? But I guess the assumption is that the Reserve Bank will do whatever it can to stop that happening. Too big to fail.
Or what you get is then the organisation gets taken over by the government, and then reorganised and sold back into the private sector at a later date, which is the sort of thing which should happen any functional capitalist economy. You go into receivership and try to, in the process of receivership, revive it such that it can be restarted afterwards, after the necessary debt write-off has occurred. And China's more likely to do that effectively than most Western countries.
But I mean, that's not good for risk management, is it? I mean, if you're running a company and you're told you can get as big as you want, get a cheap loan, look, if it all comes crashing down, don't worry, the government will buy you and sell you off again. If
it depends on whether you get kicked out of the company and lose your shares, and your shares go to zero, and your bondholders lose their money. And I don't know the extent to which that happens in China, but that's what you'd want to have happen. The company continues as potentially going concern. The existing shareholders and bondholders lose their shirts. That's the correct way to go about it. And I don't know the extent to which that actually happens in China. There's bound to be an enormous amount of if you're a favoured member of the party, then you're not going to lose your shirt. But if you're not a favoured member, you can end up in jail. And they've seen a fair bit of that happening as well recently. So
that's corporate debt, which is growing and is perhaps not. I mean, you'd be thinking corporate debt growing is a good thing if you've got a growing economy, because it's there helping sustain growth. I mean, normally that would be taken as a good sign.
Well, corporations, at least when corporations borrow, they're doing it to produce something they can actually sell.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this is going to be housing speculation stuff as well. We've stopped talking about the abandoned skyscraper residences in China, but they're still there, and a lot of this there's a way in which China's let itself get infected by the same disease the West has, which is people think that their savings are tied up in the value of real estate, and therefore the government's now feeling a bit of pressure to make sure real estate prices keep on rising. So that is partially where a bit of madness is coming from.
So look, this is just the beginning of this story on China. If you want to hear it in full, then you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, or you can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. And we'll see you back here again next time for another one. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.